we acknowledge that Vanier College is located on the unceded territory. Unceded meaning it was never signed away in a treaty. The unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka peoples, who are also known as Mohawk. They are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is also known as the Iroquois or Six Nations Confederacy. This land was also, there was also a great presence of Anishinaabe and other nations in this region of Montreal, which is called Jojage in the language of the Kanien'kehá:ka. This place still is a gathering place for many First Nations and peoples of all communities, all walks of life. And to acknowledge that this land is unceded is just one step in a larger project of reconciliation and reconciliation. Right, I saw a meme the other day that said, this month I'm going to pay my landlord a rent acknowledgement. Right, I'm going to acknowledge that I owe him the rent, but not pay and not do anything about it. So land acknowledgements can become lip service, right? Somebody reads the acknowledgement and that's it. But at Vanier, we're trying to really take action on the learnings, right? First of all, we're trying to learn as much as possible about the history and ongoing realities of colonialism for Indigenous peoples and from them directly. So this talk, for example, is a good example of this. We put the Indigenous education protocol in our strategic plan for Vanier College. We're trying to increase awareness of Indigenous issues and Indigenous voices throughout the college. So without further ado, let me get to introducing our speaker today. Michelle Wouters is a community educator, facilitator, and language consultant. She provides workshops in inclusivity, gender equality, and diversity from McGill University and the Center for Gender Advocacy at Concordia, among many other places. She has most recently worked in Vietnam and Cambodia, developing communications campaigns on gender-based violence, disability rights, and inclusivity for two-spirit LGBTQ+ folks. Michelle is also a survivor of the 60s scoop, which is an example of cultural genocide and genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada. During this period, Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed with, adopted by other families, especially white families, across Canada and sometimes in Europe. So this is an example of taking children away, not just through residential schools, but also what's known as the 60s scoop. So Michelle will tell us more about this today, and we're quite honored to have her here as a survivor. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Volume okay? Yes? Okay. So my name is Michelle Wouters. That's my adopted name. I was adopted when I was 5 weeks old, which is pretty young. And according to the two papers that I have, which is all that I have, I was born in 1970 in Prince George, British Columbia, which is pretty far north. And for some reason, my British adopted mother and Dutch father decided to adopt a third child. And they already had two biological children. And this was really common that people like me were placed in homes of white European families that already had other children, which, if you've read any fairy tale, it doesn't usually work out very well at the best of times. And it certainly didn't work out well in terms of accommodating any kind of, trauma or the different experiences of being a racialized person compared to their biological white European children. So anyway, when I was growing up, it was very much like they always told me I was adopted, but the details around my adoption were always very murky. And my parents, they kind of lied a few times and they mixed up their stories, and they got divorced when I was 9. So I didn't always compare the stories until I got much older. But most recently, I had a big falling out with my father because, as many of you know, in the summer, a lot of there began the painful process of unearthing all the unmarked graves of all the Indigenous children that were murdered or died of illness and neglect at the residential schools, if you can call them schools, all over Canada. And one of the first schools to actually dig up these graves was in Williams Lake, which is actually really close to where I was born, or where I'm possibly from. And it was kind of scary. So I decided to approach my father about it. And I said to him, I said, what's going on? I said, sometimes you said you adopted me from a hospital. And then other times you said, you picked me up at the government agency. And I was like, have you been lying to me? Was I picked up at a foster home? And he finally admitted I was picked up at a foster home. So if I was born in 1970, if I hadn't been adopted and put in this abusive, neglectful family that made me feel ashamed of being Indigenous, I could have ended up in that residential school, because in fact, the Williams Lake School did not close until 1981. So if anyone tells you the 60 scoop in residential schools is way in the past, no, it's not, because I could have been one of those people. So I was 60 scoop instead of residential school. I don't know if it's any savings grace, but it's pretty terrible, the whole situation. I mean, that with the unmarked graves, just the number just getting into the thousands, and seeing the inaction and just the absolute, I don't know, the cognitive dissonance of systemic racism in Canada is pretty intense. And to think the foundation of this nation is literally built on a genocide and massive land theft and forcible evacuation and forcible abduction of children to grab land and resources. I mean, it must be really hard for some people to face that truth. And I think we're at that point right now in our, history, in our shared, history, that we need to acknowledge that perhaps Canada's history is a lot darker than most people want to admit. People have comforted themselves with this myth of Canada being like this kind and open and green and whatever, but all evidence proves it to the contrary. And I think this is the point where when people finally, like me, finally feel safe, confident enough, angry enough, whatever, motivated enough to come forward and share our story and try to find out information, and just have this wall, like there's no information, the files were burned, oh, that office, no, they didn't keep files, the complete denial, a lot of denial on the part of institutions and the people who work for them. Just last week, I went to a CLSA because I'm dealing with a lot of social issues right now. Oh, okay. I'm dealing with a lot of social issues. Is that better? And we met with a social worker, and this woman has a master's degree in social work, and she's from Quebec, and she's never heard of the 60 scoop. And for me, it's really hard for me to imagine that there's someone who is a social worker who doesn't know about the biggest wholesale abduction of children committed by social workers in Quebec and Canada. And it kind of boggles my mind. So for people who haven't heard of it, if you're a newcomer and they don't teach this history much in many places in Canada, the 60s scoops started well before the 60s. It started in the 50s, and it continued right until the 80s. Well, in fact, it continues now because so many Indigenous children are in foster care. So basically in the 50s and 60s, as the government started to fade out the residential schools, they, realized they had all these people that really could not cope with life back on the reserve. They didn't know how to function in white Western society, but they also didn't know how to function anymore as First Nations people because they had been beaten into submission by the nuns. And so what was particularly cruel was that some survivors of residential school were finally released and they were allowed to go back to their land or to the reserve or to their community. And these people were deeply traumatized by violence they were subjected to or witnessed. And then when some of them started to have families and they were completely traumatized and didn't know how to be parents or raise children, the same people who were responsible for their health and welfare, the government people, came along and said, "Oh, you're terrible parents and you don't know how to take care of your children." They used that against them and they took away their children. And there was one social worker who said they took so many babies. They went to communities, they just would go in and they would just scoop up the babies in their arms. They took so many children that they said they felt like they were scooping them up. And I think what we need to keep in mind is that this isn't just a scoop. This is a forced assimilation of children in a dominant colonial culture. And that loss of language and culture and identity is irreparable. I mean, there's anybody who's been adopted can tell you there's never a day that doesn't go by that you don't think about who's your birth mother, who's your birth family, where are you really from? And, growing up in British Columbia, moving here in Quebec, there's not a day that somebody doesn't go, "Oh, where are you from?" And I say, "I'm from Canada." And they go, "No, where are you really from?" And, they look at my eyes and like, "Oh, your eyes." And I'm like, the fact that people actually might think I'm Asian or Latina or whatever before they'd even imagine that I'm a living, relative of Canada's First Nations is something that's really, really hard to take sometimes. So just to get back to the idea of the 60 scoop. So just to come back to when you think about how many children were taken away, again, we don't know how many children were also taken away from their homes and didn't even make it to the foster home or to the adoptive home. Like so many children were so sick and beaten and abused that they just didn't make it. And the figure that is often quoted in the media, and if I had my Canva presentation that's not working, I had slides with information. The figure quoted is generally 20,000 children. Now, I mean, I'm sure that number is a lot higher, but still 20,000 children forcibly removed. So if you think about even what the States has been doing at the border with Latin American children, like how many of those children have been forcibly separated from their parents? So imagine this happened here in Canada. And I mean, imagine I'm 5 weeks old. I mean, I was 5 weeks old when I was adopted. So I was obviously taken from my mother when I was born. And I have zero information. There's absolutely nothing. I've tried to find things out. I can't get anything. And it's been a really, really hard struggle. And before I go on about my adoption, I just want to talk about the idea of adoption in general. I do not want to criticize parents who've had to adopt because they've had fertility challenges or whatever. I know there are wonderful people who adopt children and welcome them in their home, and they're great parents. And if they adopt children from, another culture or race, some of them do make an effort to, make sure their child is encouraged to explore where they're really from. But I also know that when we talk about adoption and family, it's, I don't know a lot of happy adoptees, I'm sorry to say. I mean, I know they exist, but I personally don't know many. Most people I know, by the time they become adults, like by their 20s, most of us have had some kind of major rupture with our adoptive parents because the parents are unwilling to share the entire truth behind our story. They can be very insensitive to the fact that we want to know more about our original culture, like, because we're supposed to feel ashamed if we're Korean or if we're Indigenous or Black or whatever. And we're supposed to be so grateful to be adopted by white Europeans, and that's going to somehow improve our life or we'll gain in social prestige. It just makes things worse when you feel like you're supposed to feel grateful for being separated from your birth mother and never allowed to know your culture or your language or your identity. I mean, that part is really, really hard for me to accept. And so when I think about how some people go, well, you should consider yourself lucky. My my adopted mother used to say to me, you should consider yourself lucky. You could have been left in an orphanage. I mean, that's a really cruel thing to say. I don't know how she could do that and why she does that, but that's, we no longer have a relationship, and there's many reasons why. So, but I'd like to come back to the idea of the 60s scoop and what was going on, just to give like step back and not just talk about Canada, because I've lived overseas a few times. And when I was 27, I moved to Korea, and I had to deal with like people seeing me, people really didn't think I was Canadian. I had to like say, I'm Canadian. They're like, you look Asian, you look this, you look that. Like nobody could see that I was a real Canadian because they didn't really think Indians still existed. So it was a really interesting thing for me to acknowledge that I blended in the country in Korea. And then all of a sudden I started meeting all these adoptees who were Korean born, who'd also been sent out by the missionaries and, all the organizations that just thought, these children would be better off if they were sent to European families. And there's this huge diaspora of Korean adoptees sent all over Europe and the States and Canada. And I met these people, and they come all the way to Korea to find something out about their culture, about their mothers, about where they're from. And I realized that I had no idea about where I'm from or how to even find out that information. And the more I did try to do research when I came back to Canada, the more I realized that information has been deliberately withheld. It's been deliberately, in some places, just deleted, erased, because of all the, nefarious practices that were going on. And it made me feel really sad that there were people who could come to Korea and find out more about where they're from. And I'm from Canada. And in my own country, I can't really find out where I'm from and what language I'm supposed to speak and, who my community really is. And it makes me really sad. On the other hand, I've met quite a few 60s scoop people, and sometimes knowing the story isn't always that great either. There's a lot of really painful, traumatic family stories that very hard to hold space and to hear. I'm gonna cry if I even think about it. So normally at this point, I have a bunch of slides with a bunch of stats, but I can remember everything. I have photographic memory. So usually at this point, if I was in front of you in the crowd, I'm sorry I couldn't come in person today, but a lot of things going on in my personal life. So normally I start with, when was the first residential school open? And, I asked them from the crowd. Sometimes people know, and if you don't know, it's 1831. So actually, residential schools are actually older than the entire country of Canada. So they started this project, they had a long-term plan. And the last residential school closed in 1996. So this is not ancient history. I graduated from university. I graduated from McGill in 1995. So, this is very much in my lifetime. It is a subject for us. It's very much contemporary. So that's where I'd like to start is everyone in Canada should know about the 60s scoop. And especially, the younger generations coming up. The denial is pretty intense, sometimes at the grandparent level. Some people have open grandparents, some people just live in denial. I don't talk to those people anymore. But when I think about how many people I've met in my personal life having to deal with institutions, and how many doctors, nurses, social workers, pharmacists, people who should know, and the healthcare profession who should know something about Canada's history, should know there's this whole segment of the population of people like me, 60 scoop survivors, and we have zero medical history. So every time I go to the doctor or the pharmacist, they got medical history, and I have a blank sheet, nothing. And they say, how can you have nothing? I mean, lots of, even adoptees have something. I said, I'm from the 60s scoop. And some people go, oh, and they go, they show a little bit of sympathy. But most of the time, it's like, as soon as they realize that I am First Nations, Autochthon, Indian, you can see their face change. Like if they're going to be mean, if they're going to be racist, you see this look like, oh, Autochthon. And all of a sudden their attitude is different. The way they treat me is different. I mean, it boggles the mind, especially when it is the most frequent time I get discriminated against is when I am trying to access healthcare services. So when I'm sick, when I'm vulnerable, when I really need some compassion and some care, this is when I get even more targeted than ever, because they can see that I'm not a pure laine Québécois or old stock WASP Canadian. And I went through years of cancer treatment. I battled stage 3 breast cancer. And I had about 2 years of dealing with the Notre Dame and a few other hospitals as well. And it was absolutely mind-blowing how terrible some of the staff would treat me if I was alone. So I had to arrange to have someone accompany me to each and every blood test, every chemo appointment, every drip, every test. Otherwise, I would be neglected. I would be treated like, it was awful. I can't even tell you. I can't even talk about it. It's like, it was awful. I mean, another time I'll record it. I can't talk about that right now. It's too mind blowing. But I've talked to a lot of people, especially in my age group who are 60 scoop survivors. I mean, it is nightmarish for us. Like, and when things don't go well, it's not like, we can't go back to our land or our community or because we don't know where we're from. And most of us have been rejected, neglected, or abused by our adoptive family. So we live in this kind of netherworld where we really don't have family or community. We just have our friends, if we're lucky. And that kind of makes things worse, because the reason why I don't know my family is because that information has deliberately been withheld. And according to the UN, that forcible removal of children is a type of cultural genocide. And I feel like some people don't like it when I use that word. They think it's too strong. They think it's too much. It's very hard for people to face, to accept. And I think that one thing we have to do in Canada is to get more people to accept that they have to, reconcile with the fact that there has been a genocide. There has been, a really, really terrible thing has happened in our shared history, and we need to acknowledge it so we can heal and we can find a way to move forward, because it's too grave a crime. It's a gigantic, massive crime against humanity, and it's not being taken seriously enough. And it makes me feel like I don't know how to share this message. I mean, I tried to I was invited to give workshops by the English Montreal School Board. The first few I gave went really well, and the students were very accepting, and they had lots of questions, and it went so well. And then all of a sudden, some of the teachers started to complain. They thought the material was too strong, or the content, oh, use the word genocide, use the word massacre, oh no. And I'm like, well, if I could endure racism at the age of 4, why can't somebody learn about it? And I wasn't teaching to 4-year-olds. These kids were like 10, 11 years old. I mean, if I learned about Anne Frank and the Holocaust and whatever when I was in grade 4, 9, 10, why can't students here in Canada learn about residential schools and the 60s scoop? Like, what's the difference? Why can't we learn the ugly truth? Because if you don't learn the ugly truth, you don't move forward. And I feel like this is why there's such discord right now, because there's so many people who refuse to see the truth and acknowledge it. And it kind of makes me really sad. Anyway, so normally I play a song at this point. I'm going to try to share a video with you. The next point I wanted to talk about is, so we have been stripped of our culture, of our identity, everything like that. But even people who have community and have status and they know their culture and they're proud of it, there are still so many ways the system, the government tries to strip away, degrade, demean, diminish Indigenous culture, or find ways to undermine or not support it. And I think the good thing nowadays is that there is this younger generation, and they are vocal, they're active, they're creative, they're building on what's left, what they can find. And so one of the people I like to share, there's a few artists I like to share when I talk about these things, just to give myself a break and people a break, is Jeremy Dutcher. And he is from a very tiny community in New Brunswick, where there's just a handful of people that still speak his language. And he won the Polaris Prize. He's pretty amazing. And he's also classically trained in opera. So since this is from the CBC, I think it will be okay to play this clip, Layla, I hope. I'm just going to play part of it. It's from a broadcast from CBC, so I can acknowledge the link and we should be okay. So yeah, I want you to listen to this person who had the chance to listen to his community's archives of the last singers and last speakers of the language from his community. And it's really special. It's very touching. So even if a lot of us were forcibly separated from our culture and our language, there's still a few people around who are trying to reclaim it and keep it going. And this is a great example of that. So let's see if I can share and you can hear it.
You guys ready?
Okay. All right, let's see here. I hope I can do this. I'm trying. Is it working?
Congratulations, by the way. On what? On everything. Thank you. How'd it feel? Unreal. Yeah, unreal, man. My family was there. My elder was there. So many of my dear friends. My band was there. It was just such a beautiful evening, and yeah, my first record. Your first record. My first record.
It's working.
But also, like a lot of years, into figuring this out.
Yeah.
Like how long did it take even to find the stuff?
Yeah, so this from, I guess, inception to completion, it was about 5 years.
Wow.
So my elder Maggie.
Oh,
Hall,
no,
who's about
okay.
to hear on this recording actually, told me about this archive
Shoot.
that existed, that was collected among our people 110 years ago. And so she said, if you want to know about our really old songs, the traditional songs, you gotta go to the museum. So I took that.
Why is it not
seed of an
working?
idea, and that became the album. I went to this archive, listened to these voices from 110 years ago, and then started to build arrangements around them. So
What's it like to listen to it? Like when you listen to it, I'm sure the songs didn't come right to you because you're dealing with
Sorry.
emotions, you're processing
I
it,
thought
you're
it was
processing it,
working.
like,
I'm so sorry. Okay.
Michelle?
Yeah.
Michelle? Sorry, we're looking for the video ourselves.
I'm gonna turn it off. I'm so sorry. I thought it was working. Okay, so well, what I wanted to say was that Jeremy Ditcher is someone who's worked on his reclaiming his language and is successfully, you know, making his music heard and recognized around the world. And I hope that as we continue to oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah. Can you play this one? Excellent. Okay.
A better understanding of my language realistically. I started to understand my place in the world a little bit better and started to relate to the world around me differently. And so that's why it was important for me to do this album in my language, because there's less than 100 fluent speakers left.
That was wonderful. Yeah, that's him.
I think it's important for people to understand a true history and what has actually happened and what continues to happen in this country around the systematic devaluing of Indigenous languages. When I came into a better understanding of my language realistically, I started to understand my place in the world a little bit better and started to relate to the world around me differently. And so that's why it was important for me to do this album in my language, because there's less than 100 fluent speakers left. I think it's important for people to understand a true history and what has actually happened and what continues to happen in this country around the systematic devaluing of Indigenous languages and culture. As soon as I came to understand a little more about my mother's journey with the language, she went into the day schools at a very young age when she was 6 years old, and you weren't allowed to speak your language there. In fact, you were physically punished, you were beaten if you did. You know, coming to understand that it wasn't safe for her to speak her language when she was young. And her mother, my grandmother, said, you know, it's better if you don't know the language, and so we're just not going to speak it to you. Intergenerational effects of that shame around language and culture are clear. And so that's why I turned to the archive. When I first got to hear these voices, that for me was a profoundly transformational moment in my life. And it connected me all the way up and down to those who have gone before and those who have yet to come. At first, I would listen over and over again. I would start to sketch where the melody was going. And then finally, after that, I could put some notes to it. I sort of took those notes with me and went home and started to sit at my piano. And to create arrangements and worlds around each of these melodies, and let those melodies guide my process. I was very, very fortunate, to have a music education and to be able to, to transcribe what I was hearing. It was a process of deep listening, of really trying to sit there with these headphones and hear what these voices had to tell me. Getting to witness the life in these recordings, getting to hear my ancestors laugh, tell stories, sing songs, dance. You can hear them dancing. This is incredible to me. This was collected in the early 1900s, and it's been living in the museum ever since. As a young person, I didn't know about this collection and these songs, and so for me, I felt such a responsibility to go and share that with other young people. So when you look at the album cover, you can see wax cylinders on the floor, which were what these were collected on, using the phonograph machine in the middle there. And I'm seated in the chair with this traditional jacket on. I wanted to represent that time that these songs were collected. And so that was sort of where this whole album kind of came from, was that impetus to say, I've witnessed this beautiful thing, these old voices, and it's not doing any good sitting on a shelf collecting dust. This project allowed me to do is sit down with my mother and my elders in my community and ask them about their lives and say, what was your experience of music growing up? What did your community sound like, growing up? For me, starting, this record, it's called, with a death chant, Mejalid, was a very clear statement to me that even though a lot of narratives get applied to our languages, especially Wolastoqey, because there's so few speakers left, a lot of people say, oh, it's a dying language, I don't believe that to be true. Nothing ever died. Our dances and our songs and our language, they just had to go away for a bit for safekeeping. And our elders tell us that it's time to take it all out, and it all needs to come out. And it won't be until then that we're going to be able to come to understand each other. Tahu.
Are you going to play the honor song as well, or we'll leave it there for now? Well, that's a great clip. That's really, I think it's really important to show that because, yeah, 100 speakers left. It's so exciting to know that he managed to capture not only a chance to experience the voices of his ancestors, but to kind of, reuse them and make sure that they're heard again for new generations. There's another artist I like to talk about a lot when I give presentations, and normally I would play a clip. I will ask her for copyright permission for the next time I have to do a recorded thing. I've met her before, and it's Tanya Tagak. And I imagine, quite a few people have heard of her. Tanya Tagak is an Inuk woman, and she is someone who was living down south, going to university, and she was really missing her culture. And she remembered how her grandmother used to throat sing. And although she didn't have someone, normally it's done in tandem with another singer, she just did it by herself in the shower. And she started doing her own version of throat singing and expressing, what she had inside her. And just became this incredible original talent. And if you ever get a chance to experience Tanya Tagak live, go, but be prepared because an emotional roller coaster. Absolutely incredible range of emotion, and words can't even express, but yeah, she's incredible. Another group of artists, I usually actually start with this song, so I will also write them and ask them if I can use their music. And they were called A Tribe Called Red, and they were a group of Indigenous guys who are also hip hop electronic DJs. And they started these events in Ottawa called the Electric Powwow. And similar to Jeremy, they had access to recordings of their elders doing traditional drumming and singing. And they asked permission to use samples from these recordings, and they incorporated those beats and those voices and the chanting, the big drums and whatnot into hip hop electronic dance music. And it created this incredible sensation. And they're actually really famous around the world. I've met people from like Croatia and Brazil who've seen A Tribe Called Red live and just love them. There's something very elemental about music like that captures the spirit of the past, and also the energy and the motivation to keep moving forward. And one thing I noticed when I worked up north with Indigenous communities, that there is a very strong preference towards hip hop and rap music among communities, Indigenous, Inuit, Métis communities. And I think it's because, it comes down to the basic elements, which is, there's a beat, there's a story, there's talking, singing about a story, a struggle, a song. It's very similar when you come down to the basic elements of it. So no wonder there is that attraction. And I mean, if you see some of those hoop dancers and all the fancy footwork that they do, it's kind of similar to some break dancing and b-boy dancing as well. So there's some very interesting parallels that you don't always see right away, but it's nice to know that there are traditional aspects of indigenous culture that still have some relevance, and they resonate with youth today. Another thing I'd like to talk about is when we do talk about culture and trying to reclaim identity and to feel proud, it must be mentioned that for a very long time, it was actually illegal for Indigenous and Inuit and Métis people to express their culture, literally like illegal. So it can't be underestimated how crucial that was in instilling shame and instilling a sense of negativity and just violence, the way pain and violence was used to eradicate what was Indian in a child and in their culture. Beaten for speaking their language, beaten if they sang a song, beaten if they danced. Even community events like potlatches, shared community feasts were banned, or feasts were banned. So any form of sharing and community and appreciating culture and music was banned by the Canadian government in this attempt to, assimilate us into white European culture, because dancing and sharing food was savage or something somehow. And so that part is really hard to accept sometimes, when you meet people who are, full status Indian and they don't know anything about their music or their culture. And sometimes someone like me who was adopted by white people and raised off the res, sometimes I know more about some certain aspects of Indigenous culture because I've had to seek it out for myself. And although, there are people in my white Western adoptive family who tried to make me feel ashamed of being Indigenous, there were also some very good people in my extended family, especially, who were very positive and encouraged me to express my indigeneity. And I have a cousin who was also adopted from the 60 Scoop. And so not everything was negative, but it's still very, very hard to find a way to express what is culture, because sometimes for me, even when I'm trying to like share music that I like or talk about Indigenous culture, there's a part of me that almost feels like I'm appropriating culture because I didn't grow up with this. But when you see how other people who are non-Indigenous, so very thoughtlessly sometimes help themselves to Indigenous culture, and you throw around terms like my totem, my spirit animal, and sell, dream catchers online, call themselves shamans and healers. Sometimes that's really offensive. And I have to say it seems like nothing for some people, but sometimes when I give presentations, especially at high schools, I actually start with the idea of cultural appropriation and what does it mean. And I talk about Halloween, and I talk about mascots. I talk about being reduced to a cartoon-like pet animal-like character and how demeaning that is for living, relatives of our ancestors. I talk a lot about the idea of like costume versus regalia. I talk about how, it's really insulting that people think they can dress up in a Pocahontas costume when, in my mother's lifetime, who feasibly who would have been my mother, it was not even legal for her to be, and Native women didn't even get like status or the right to vote in Canada until the 60s. So I think about those things, these things, and people casually help themselves to a culture, and then other people who really want to express their culture or speak their language and they can't. And the reason why they can't is because they're very deliberate obstacles put in place by the government to systematically deny access to those cultures. Because if people felt proud of being Indigenous, they wouldn't be assimilated. And then if we're not all assimilated, they can't take all our land for fracking and other nefarious resource extraction industries. So yeah, I like to talk about culture and appropriation, and how even when someone is from a culture, they still ask permission from their elders to use a sample of someone's voice or their drumming or whatever. Nobody thinks they can just help themselves to something, even if they're from that culture. And I think that's why sometimes it feels very, very difficult to explain to people who, when you don't know where you're from, how much it hurts every time somebody asks you, no, but where are you really from? And I can't answer the question. And the reason why I can't is because it was a policy, that was enacted to deny me access to my culture and my language. And it's really hard. So the next thing I usually do, and I show a video at this point. Oh, I can't believe my presentation didn't work, but we'll just keep going. So after I talk about cultural appropriation and mascots and regalia and how, Lana Del Rey shouldn't be wearing one in one of her videos, I move on to the idea of, I talk about representation in general of Indigenous people in the media and how we're portrayed, how we're perceived, how the media, especially white majority culture media, how they depict us and how the cultural bias, the embedded cultural bias, how intense it is. And then I talk about, ways we need to overcome those terrible stereotypes, because they're very deeply ingrained, and it's pretty awful. I mean, CBC, Radio Canada had to turn the comments off back in Harper's, like in 2010. Any issue, any article, any news item, any video clip that featured any kind of sympathetic view towards Indigenous, Inuit, or Métis people, there would be just a firestorm of racist, really hateful comments from majority culture Canadians. So they had to just turn the comments off for a long time. And it's really hard because I have, I'm an activist. I post things on social media. I post about Palestine. I post about Ukraine. I post about Yemen. I've lived abroad, Vietnam, Laos, Korea. I've lived in a lot of 3 countries that were post-war and got really damaged by other colonial invaders and have survived. And it's always shocking when I come back to Canada and would try to point out very clearly, what happened in Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos, like that's a genocide and we had a genocide too. And that there would be still so many Canadians, especially WASPy ones, that refuse to accept that word, just refuse. And it's like, the Holocaust was a few years, it was during the time of World War II. And it did take a long time for some people to accept the truth. I just can't believe that still now in 2022, even with all the unmarked graves and, we're in the thousands, we're in the 7,000s now, there's still people who refuse to believe that whole segments of Indigenous populations were eradicated, exterminated, like killed for profit, just to get at their land. I mean, and there's still people who refuse to accept that and they'd rather denigrate us and say nasty things and post nasty things than just say, wow, that's really horrible. I didn't learn that in school. I guess I have some studying to do. That's all we want to hear, nobody's blaming people alive now for what happened in the past. Just want people to read and to listen and ask questions and not interrupt and give, their view of history. We want them to listen to us for once. And that's really hard. I mean, I've had some terrible experiences, encounters with people online, in person. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you some of the hate that I've received, death threats, things on Facebook, and terrible. I mean, shocking, actually. So when I can't get to that point, usually this is when I stop and I talk about the idea that I have some great stats I normally show about how women are perceived in Canada, and we have a very big gender-based violence problem in Canada against all women of all colors, including white women. But we also have a huge problem when it comes to racial profiling by police against Black women and Indigenous women in particular. And the stats are just horrific for how Indigenous women in particular are treated, neglected, and ignored in this culture. And it's like they've been demeaned from the start. I mean, literally not given personhood under the Indian Act, and not allowed to vote. And I had an auntie who was a status Indian who married my white uncle. And when she married my uncle and left the reserve, she lost all her status as an Indigenous woman. And then years later, when things didn't work out with my, white Western uncle, big surprise, she couldn't go back to her community and reclaim her status. I think her children eventually did, but she didn't. And that kind of, rejection from both sides, it doesn't make it easy for people to reclaim their culture or their language if they don't get accepted on either side. And I've seen that a lot with women who've been rejected by their communities and end up marrying a white man. And then when it doesn't work out, they not always accepted to go back. And I think that because it was a law and a policy under the Indian Act, I think that undermined the very safety and personhood of Indigenous women in Canada. So they've always had less in terms of even just legal status and to be able to vote. And I think that's why today we still have this pervasive just terrible, terrible. Like, I mean, it's out of control, actually. The situation of women's health and safety and violence and the incarceration rates of Indigenous women in Canada is shocking. It is beyond acceptable for a Western country. I mean, according to the UN, I mean, it's unbelievable. How many women are overrepresented in the prison system in Canada? When a white woman goes up into the court for the same crime, an Indigenous woman often gets a much tougher sentence, sometimes 3 times longer. It's absolutely shocking. And I think another thing we need to consider is that this historical, like deliberately stripping Indigenous women of their rights and their personhood is why we have this critical problem with the MMIW today, the murdered and missing Indigenous women. Now we say murdered and missing Indigenous women, trans, and non-binary people. And it's very serious. If we looked at the population in proportion, so if there's over 1,000 murdered and missing Indigenous women right now in Canada, if we looked at proportion to the population, that would be like an entire town, like a town of, say, about 30,000 people, maybe Trois-Rivières, is that 30,000 people? That'd be that many white women missing. And yeah. Okay, so okay, I'm getting a message here. So yeah, why don't we wrap up? And I just want to mention that, and we'll have some questions, that everything comes down to is, in the end, is how you are treated when you are in your most vulnerable state. So when you are in the hospital, when you're at school, and when you are giving birth as a woman. And if those areas and what happens to your child, if they end up in foster care, and if in all of those areas, this is where there's a serious problem. It's literally institutional neglect. And we need to talk about those things and make sure this doesn't keep happening. Because in some places, like in Manitoba, over 90% of the children in foster care are Indigenous. I mean, that's awful. That's awful. This, like, the 60s scoop is still happening. Anyway, okay, so I'll just wrap up there for now, and then we can ask some questions if anybody has any questions, and see if
Thank you so much, Michelle. Can you hear us? Can you hear
yes,
me?
I can, loud and clear.
Alison here again. I don't know if you can see
I hope
me.
it's okay. Just blah blah blah. Even though I didn't have my visuals.
Do we have any questions from the audience or from online?
Hello, I have a
Hello?
question.
Yes.
So considering the current rise in conservative and even far-right movements across the Western world, do you feel optimistic about the future of Indigenous rights?
Not here, no. In fact, after I recovered from stage 3 breast cancer, I left Canada in 2018, 2019, because I could see it coming. I could feel it coming. But when COVID hit, I lost my job, and we were in Cambodia and had a great life there. And the Canadian embassy pressured us to come back and said, you know, you should be here just in case, blah, blah, blah. I wish I'd stayed in Asia. It's been horrible being back here. I feel like as awareness has raised about Indigenous issues in Canada, the way I am treated walking down the street is 10 times worse. It's so bad. I got racially profiled the second we stopped over in Vancouver from flying from Asia. It was awful. And just the other day, I went shopping with my partner at Pharmaprix to pick up some medication. And he's like, God, I mean, do you always get treated like that? And I'm like what? And he goes, well, when I'm by myself, I just get way more respect. And I'm like, yeah, welcome to my world. Literally get followed around stores. It's just like I'm suspicious or I'm gonna steal. It's awful. And I do worry about lots of places with minorities. I worry about the Rohingya in Myanmar. I worry about the Uyghurs in China. I worry about all of my other Indigenous brothers and sisters, you know, around the world who are being oppressed by this rise of the right wing. On the other hand, there's all these very positive pockets of rebellion and people using social media and TikTok and, Korean people, blocking, terrible, racist groups and hate groups. And, there's all kinds of wonderful examples of people rising up against that tyranny as well and not laying down and letting it happen. So although I feel not very safe here anymore, and I really want to go abroad again, I do think there is hope. There is some hope, but we need people like newcomers to Canada to learn to listen to us, because it's not included in the little rosy version of Canada and the immigration booklet that gets handed out, And yeah, I think you also have to realize that there is what happened in Canada with the residential schools in the 60s scoop. This happened in many other places around the world as part of the colonial experiment. Whether you're talking about the mission schools in New Zealand, Aotearoa with the Maori, where they're Aboriginal Australians in Australia, whether we're talking about the Sami in northern Sweden and northern Scandinavia. There are people, they look just like me. I mean, I've met Sami. I mean, they look just like me, like kind of vaguely Bjork looking features. And they were also put in residential schools that were run by the clergy, where they were beaten and starved, and terrible things happened to them too. So this is not just something that happened in North America. This was a worldwide thing. I mean, the Spanish Inquisition, the mission schools in South America and Brazil. I mean, you can watch that film, The Mission, with Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro about those mission schools. There was a lot of violence promoted by people who thought they were doing good things. It wasn't just from a place of hate. Some people really thought they were helping to educate, the wild savages at one point. They really thought they were doing something good. They really didn't, understand how detrimental it was to people's culture and their sense of self.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think we have several ethics classes here today.
Oh, ethics class.
Another question? Okay. Great, thanks.
Second question, Dan.
Yeah.
What do you think about reserves?
What do I think about reserves? I don't know. What do you think about if you owned if you lived in a huge community of land that was shared among your community, and all of a sudden they drove you away and they put you in an area where you couldn't grow food or hunt or fish, and all they gave you was white flour, white sugar, lard, rations from the church? How would you feel?
Pretty bad.
Oh, yeah. No, I think reserves are disgusting. I mean, it's like it's segregation. It's Soweto. It's South Africa.
Do you think in the
It's
future
black
we
people
will-
and red people go here, and white people get all the waterfront property and the nice houses. No, I think reserves they're wrong. But I think that there should be swathes of land that are shared land and community land, but it shouldn't be called a reserve.
do you think in the future reserves will be abolished? And if so, what would replace them?
I think we're waiting for it, like, hey, Queen Elizabeth, you got the bill of sale. We'd like to see a receipt for the land you say you bought. It's going to be a mess. I mean, people are going to have to, they're going to have to give the land back as at least a certain amount. And it's going to be very tricky because of our colonial past with England, who think they hold the deeds to our country. But no, I think reserves are awful. I mean, do you think that what's going on with the Gaza Strip in Israel and Palestine is right? Like literally building walls around people? I mean, that's what they did here. And yeah, no, I think reserves are horrible. I mean, I think only 2% of Canada is allotted to Indigenous communities, 2% of this gigantic country. It's horrible. And also if you've ever been to a reserve, it's pretty depressing because 40%, 40, not 14, 40% of reserves in Canada do not have clean running water. You cannot drink the water. You have to boil water or you have to buy it. That's horrible because you're out in the middle of nowhere and the water isn't safe to drink because the Canadian government has allowed some giant conglomerate like Unilever or something to, pollute the river nearby with affluent and pollution. Or in some cases, they've let Nestle literally drain the aquifer and ground tables of the water table in some communities. Literally turned Colorado, some parts of Colorado into a desert. So yeah, reserves. So horrible. I'd like to leave you with one little fact about Indigenous people. We only make up about, depending, this is very approximate, about 8% of the world's population. Like from the Sami in Sweden to the Guarani in Brazil to the Okinawa in Japan. We only make up 8% of the world's population, but where we live, where we steward, where we take care of the land, we are taking care, we're the guardians, we take care of 80% of the world's biodiversity. So if we die, so does everything else.
One final question.
Mhm.
What do you think about the
Sorry, we're gonna go to someone else and then maybe.
Oh, okay.
All right. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Were you doing Jeopardy? That's great background music. Do, 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 do.
Michelle, I have a
Hi.
question. I'm here with my students
Mhm.
in the caregiving milieu. So they're studying to be nurses and early childhood educators and special care counselors and stuff.
Uh-huh.
My question is, what do you think, what would you like caregivers to know about Indigenous people?
Actually, I have designed some workshops, and I think that people who work in healthcare and education and social work shouldn't just have like one workshop. They need to have at least 4, like a 4-part, where they get some history and then they get some knowledge about, what triggers Indigenous people and all the trauma that happens. I mean, I didn't realize how much I carried inside me until I got sick with cancer. And I can tell you, there was something like deep in my DNA, like when this one nurse came after me with a needle and kept poking me and poking me. And I was like, you can't do a needle on this side. I had a needle, I can't really see it, but I had so many needles, so much IV chemo done in this side that my veins collapsed. So there's literally nothing that is like a block. And she kept trying to give me a needle there. And I'm like, hello, lady, I know my body, stop doing that. And she literally poked me 3 times until she finally tried another area. She literally like, poke. Oh, I'm sorry, poke. It was ridiculous. And it was like, why wouldn't she listen to me? Why wouldn't she listen to her patient who said, my veins have collapsed. You got to do it on the other side.
So it's about listening, good listening skills.
Really good listening skills. And also you need to come from a trauma informed background. And, I haven't done this one in a while. I've given this workshop, I could certainly update it, especially after Joyce Echequan. But I used to give a workshop especially for like people like people on the board of directors of like nonprofits and people like that, because we had a real problem for quite a while, some pretty insensitive people like not understanding like basic things about Indigenous culture and history and why we're so traumatized and triggered by certain things. It's not easy to go to the doctor or the dentist after having been subjected to really racist treatment while I was very vulnerable. I did almost 2 years of chemotherapy. if I walk past the Notre Dame Hospital, I start to shake. Like it is a deep, like it's visceral, the PTSD. It's intense, you know? So people need to know that you could be the nicest, sweetest, most caring nurse in the world, but if your patient has been subjected to trauma, they might still have a really bad reaction and have a panic attack or a meltdown. And you need to know how to deal with that and not judge them for it.
I'm looking at the times at 2:15.
Are we okay?
Yeah,
I think it is.
question, are we, it's Friday afternoon, right before our March break, so.
I understand. Everybody must be so tired.
Thank you so much for this wonderful.
Well, I wish I could have come live, but you know, I'm also a caregiver myself, and it's also probably better for my health. I've been pretty sick lately, but yeah, I'd love to come again. And for the care workers, please send me an email. Maybe we can do a special session for, you know, when people are who might be working with vulnerable populations. They should really do a session with me or with someone else. It's really important to know what you're dealing with, because people can really shut down and get defensive, and it can be very hard to connect, even though they need to connect with you as a healthcare worker. It can be really hard. But anyway, thank you so much, Layla and Vanier College. And I'd love to come back and speak live in person when things are better for me health-wise and everything. But I really appreciate everybody listening, and sorry about all the technical difficulties. I can send you a bunch of links of the stuff that was in my Canva, and we can share that another time if you like.
Great, thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Take care. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good March break.
Happy spring break, everyone.